Good morning. All right. Well, we're going to get started because I know folks are joining us. But again, good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Rodriguez, and I'm the Senior Director of Clinical Initiatives at the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, a conversation with Dr. Phil Yanos. But before we start, just a few things to orient you all. I'm sure you're all used to this, but just note that as you're joining the webinar, you've been placed on mute to avoid any background noise. If you come across any technical difficulties during the course of the webinar, please chat to the host, our wonderful host, Connor. She'll help you with any problems you might be having in the background. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions for our Q&A portion for today's presentation. And you can do that using the chat box feature. So just click that dialog box as we go along. And as we're having the conversation, if questions come up, please chat them in. We'll hold them and bring them back at the very end to share with Dr. Phil Yanos. And then we would also appreciate at the end of today's session for you to fill out a feedback survey. The topic that we're going to be covering today, mental health stigma, is one that really has implications for all our work. But please fill out the survey to give us feedback on this offering, but also give us any of your thoughts and feedback or ideas for future offerings on this and or any other topic that might come to mind as we go through this. And just a reminder that the recording for this presentation will be available on our CTAC website within 2 to 3 business days. And then with that said, I'd like to sort of move in. So, you know, the topic of mental health stigma is, as we know, is receiving a lot of attention. And in some ways, on the one hand, you know, mental health stigma is, and I think Phil can talk about this, is kind of reducing in many ways. As we see, you know, celebrities and other folks coming out and sharing their struggles or their mental health conditions and difficulties with mental illness, as well as the impact of COVID-19 and so many folks sort of being impacted by isolation and depression, an increasing understanding of the importance of mental health and mental illness and well-being is part of our greater expanding discussion around mental health in our society, and it's been normalized. On the other hand, we also see through the media negative views of people with mental illness, and those views of people with mental illness or severe mental illness as violent or erratic or being dangerous persist. And there's still that, in many forms, public mental health stigma that still exists today. And so there's many forms of mental health stigma. And one of the forms of mental health stigma that is incredibly challenging is self-stigma. And some folks have sort of discussed self-stigma, and it's the internalized messages, negative messages and attitudes about mental illness that folks with mental health conditions struggle with. But oftentimes what we know is that those internal thoughts, and research shows that the effects of those internal thoughts can endure even after symptoms have gone away or symptoms have subsided. So it kind of suggests that that for many people, the stigma of mental health is oftentimes or can be worse than the illness itself or the condition itself. So in order to talk about all these issues, we have invited Dr. Phil Yanos to talk a little bit about mental health stigma today. This is part of a series that we're putting together on mental health stigma, but in particular, self-stigma. And Dr. Phil Yanos, to introduce him, received his doctorate in clinical psychology from St. John's University. Prior to coming to John Jay College, where he is currently a professor at John Jay College. Prior to that, he was at the Department of Psychiatry in New Jersey at the New Jersey Medical School. He's an associate editor for the journal Stigma and Health, and the author of Written Off Mental Health Stigma and the Loss of Human Potential. And he's also the co-developer of Narrative Enhancement and Cognitive Therapy, a group-based treatment. We're going to be talking a lot about narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy as a group-based treatment to address self-stigma in particular. As I mentioned, this is part of a series. So after our conversation today, Dr. Yanos is going to be offering 2 trainings coming up in October, and we'll share the dates and information on that at the end of today's webinar. And so with all that said, one other thing that I just want to kind of mention very quickly as an introduction to the topic of why mental health stigma is important. And Dr. Yanos, in his book, in a section of his book, says that we need to view mental health stigma not just as an issue of around service use, but also an issue of social justice. And he writes, therefore, instead of viewing mental health stigma as a help-seeking issue, we should view it as a social justice issue. As this book will demonstrate, mental health stigma is linked to substantially diminished opportunities for full community participation among people diagnosed with severe mental illness. As Patrick Corrigan and others have argued, viewing stigma from a social justice perspective requires that we move away from just focusing on eradicating symptoms and instead focus on the negative social reaction to them. In this manner, the effort to overcome the effects of stigma can be linked to other social movements that have sought, with some success, to reduce the social marginalization of people from a number of backgrounds, such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons, physically disabled persons, and members of derogated racial and ethnic groups. With all that said, I'd like to open the discussion with Dr. Phil Yanos. And Phil, I just want to start by asking you a little bit about what brought you into this work on stigma, what inspired you initially, and what keeps you going in this work.
Thanks, Jim, of course, for having me in this. It's a great honor to be invited. So just want to acknowledge that, and I appreciate everyone, joining, taking time out of their day to listen to us talk about this. So I'll give you a little bit of my personal story that brings me into this work. So you have to sort of start with something important in my personal background, which is that I grew up on the grounds of a state psychiatric hospital where my father worked. And so I was kind of around this world from a young age, and aware of a lot of the ways maybe that the place that I lived was viewed, as something that was other people were maybe scared of it, in a sense. But I didn't really think about it as something that I wanted to pursue professionally until I was in college, and I was kind of confused and looking for directions to go. And I took my father's suggestion to volunteer at the hospital. And I spent time, over the summer, basically just hanging out with patients in one of the units. And it really got to know them and develop a tremendous affection for them. And I also felt incredibly welcomed by them. I was 20 years old, but they sort of saw me as somebody they wanted to help guide and teach. I'm somebody who had experienced a lot of alienation and feeling of not being welcomed in my life. So I sort of felt, in a sense, that I'd found a community. So I did start to pursue, a career in mental health. I applied to doctoral programs, and when I was I got into one, and when I was in it, I then got exposed to the concept of mental health recovery, which was relatively new at the time in the early 90s, from one of the professors there and at St. John's. And he connected me to somebody who was a big part of the what we would now call the lived experience movement, but at the time was called the consumer movement. And this was Ed Knight, who was the director of the Mental Health Empowerment Project, which kind of was the leader of the self-help creation movement, group creation process in New York State. So I got to talking to Ed, and I really started to learn about recovery from his perspective, from the perspective of somebody who'd been hospitalized, who'd been labeled, who had a doctorate in sociology, and had sort of come out the other side of hospitalization. So then I was really into recovery, and my focus was really on how do we help facilitate it? How do we help bring people to recovery? And I got very involved in developing evidence-based practices, psychoeducation, and other things like that. But it wasn't until sometime into my work at in New Jersey that where I was doing a lot of groups and other and individual therapy with people, that I started to kind of realize there was something else going on that wasn't just lack of knowledge or skill that was getting in the way of people's recovery. And it was in about 2006 that I had a conversation with David Rowe, who is now in Israel, but it was in the US at the time. And we had a long discussion around what we thought really was going on. And that's where we started to come to this understanding of self-stigma as being this kind of profound barrier to recovery for people who we saw as having so much potential, but not believing that they could, take up the skills that we were offering, or take advantage of the opportunities that the system was trying to give them. So that's where I really got into that. And that was kind of the beginning of this journey in about 2006, where we did a lot of research on self-stigma, and we developed NECT together. And Paul Lysacker was a big part of that journey as well. And as I mentioned to you right before the meeting, he passed away in July, just recently, out of the blue. Sorry, Jim, you're muted.
Thank you. Phil, when you share your story, especially the beginning of that story, which started with your exposure and contact, right? I think we know that one of the better forms of reducing stigma is contact, and you had a profound and significant contact with folks living with mental illness and mental health conditions, and so we always talk about that as an important part moving forward. And then it sounds like your career trajectory has led you to sort of think about other ways of addressing and reducing mental health stigma, focusing on self-stigma. I want to pull back a little bit just to ground folks. In doing some work with you, I know we did some work in the roundtables over the summer addressing this issue, and I learned so much from you. Just to ground folks on the notion of mental health stigma generally, and then we'll come back to self-stigma, but share with folks a little bit of, the various forms of mental health stigma. And a two-part question, the various forms of mental health stigma, but also for folks out there, we tend to think in the behavioral health settings, right? It might sound ironic, if not paradoxical, that mental health stigma can actually take place in behavioral health settings. So two things. One is, just overall and generally, what are the various forms of stigma? And then why should behavioral health providers be concerned about mental health stigma?
Right. So the first part of the question is, has a number of parts. And so that's because, as I like to say to students in one of my classes, stigma is an umbrella term that captures a lot of things. So there's, the attachment of negative stereotypes to an attribute. So we might think of that as kind of prejudice. Then there's kind of this affective response or emotional response, people with the attribute. And that could even be sort of implicit or unconscious. Then there's these behavioral manifestations. And this could be social rejection, discrimination, microaggressions, those kinds of responses to people with the attribute. And then there's the perceptions that people who are members of the group have about themselves, and that affects how they interact with others. And so this would be includes what we would call stigma concern, where you're very focused on what others might think about you. And then there's self-stigma, where you're sort of directing it toward yourself, and you believe that it's true about yourself. So those are that's a general overview of the things that are in that umbrella. I mean, there's other things. There's sort of structural stigma, things that are kind of enacted into laws and practices. But that's kind of the big picture of it. The second part of your question, I don't even remember, because I guess it's a long question.
Again, sort of the idea of why behavioral health, our audience is behavioral health providers or folks who work in the behavioral health community. And why should it be important to them? Why should they pay attention to mental health stigma?
Right. Well, first of all, it's a big part of what affects the lives of the people that you're serving. So I'm not everybody, but a substantial number. So you should be aware of it. You should be attuned to it. Um, and you should also be aware of ways in which we might reinforce it in our clinical settings, convey messages that might reinforce it. So when Pat Deegan started writing about this, many people know her work. She talked about something she called spirit breaking, and she gave this example of kind of going to her psychiatrist as a teenager who had recently been diagnosed with schizophrenia and being told, you won't be able to work, you need to kind of give up on your dreams. So that would be an extreme, manifestation of that. And I think now most people know not to do that, but there are more subtle ways that we can convey this idea to people that we don't believe that they're capable, or that we think that they should be feared, and the like. So, it's something that we can be mindful of, and just like we're mindful of other forms of bias that we might express toward other groups. And this is when it's especially important because we're working, for them.
Yeah.
This is our job.
Well, and if you can, just a few more examples. You gave the extreme example, right? But I'm wondering if you can give other examples from your experience of either more subtle or more benign ways in which behavioral health providers or in behavioral health settings, stigma can be reinforced.
Yeah, I think that we started to look into this concept of microaggressions in like 2014 and 2015, and we started by just asking people about what they'd experienced. We didn't use the term microaggressions. It didn't have the same currency that it does now at the time. So we just asked them about, these subtle, expressions, and people talked about, people sort of talking down to them like they weren't intelligent, like they couldn't have expressions of emotions that are not symptomatic, um, that they couldn't make decisions for themselves. So they talked about a lot of those kinds of things, and it was evident that a lot of these are well-meaning behaviors, and some of us in the clinical world might express them. So there does have to be a certain kind of taking stock of our interactions with people to kind of see how we might be leading people to feel invalidated, not taken seriously, when we're perhaps saying some of those things, or conveying some of those messages.
Now, moving more specifically into self-stigma, or back into self-stigma, I know you've been talking about it. As I mentioned in the opening, there was some research, and some folks talk about that in some instances, or in many instances, that actually the stigma can be worse than the condition itself. But from your perspective, what do we know about self-stigma? And to what degree is that idea true, or has truth in it?
Yeah, I can't say that we know, empirically that it's worse than the condition. But what we can empirically say is that it's a significant complicator of the recovery process. So, we know that it affects a substantial number of people. So if we look at it kind of broadly, with less, not looking at only like very high endorsement on some of these scales, we would say it affects about 75%, of people with serious mental illnesses. If we look at it a little more narrowly, we would say about a third, 30% or so. And so, so then it's a significant issue for a substantial subset of people. And then what impact does it have? And so that's kind of when David and I started thinking about this, we started doing this research with Paul, where we looked at what it predicted. And we came up with this model we called the illness identity model, and we anticipated that it predicted hope and self-esteem, that had this kind of cascade effect on suicide risk, on social interaction, on service engagement, and then that had this indirect social interaction as well, that had this indirect effect on symptom severity, and then employment and other kinds of tangible outcomes that we're trying to positively impact in the system. So we thought that it had this kind of pervasive impact, and we did some studies that found support for that. And then it kind of, that idea sort of spread, and it's been studied around the world in different ways. And so we did this big kind of review of research that had been done globally on what we call the illness identity model. We found that it's been really supported, predominantly in most of its predictions. Doesn't really matter where it's been studied, Asia, North Africa, Europe, different places that it's been studied, seems to find the same kind of patterns. So, we feel that it's important. I'm not going to say that it outweighs the impact of symptoms, but I'm going to say that it's a significant barrier, and it might be in some cases that it's a bigger barrier than the symptoms themselves, because some of the people that we work with, where we see it being a barrier, symptoms are well managed, and the symptoms in that instance are not what's getting in the way of the person going back to work or meeting people and developing new friendships and the like.
Yeah, and in those instances, what I'm hearing, in those instances, it can be
And that's
be
how I see it.
stigma that someone is still carrying.
That's how David and I saw it when we talked about it. Yeah.
Well, so let's move into interventions for mental health stigma, or self-stigma in particular.
Right. Yeah.
So and you mentioned that there are others out there. So what do we do about it, and what can we do about it? What are the interventions that have been developed to address self-stigma in particular among people?
Right. Well, the first thing I want to say is that even before we started to decide we wanted to develop a professional intervention, right, we were well aware that the peer world was addressing this in its own way. And, I mentioned how my introduction to recovery came through the lived experience movement. And so we were well aware that this was something that was being addressed in that world through, having somebody as kind of a role model of recovery, and kind of a consciousness raising process that can occur in some of the groups and the like. And so we were sort of thinking like, well, that's something that's already there, and we can always recommend that people go to those places, encourage them. But we know that a lot of people don't go, or maybe don't have access. So that's why we wanted to develop something that could be used in the clinical world. And so we developed narrative enhancement cognitive therapy. When we were developing it, no one else had developed anything, but there was kind of, it was in the air, I guess, and others started to develop things at the same time. So you could put up the slide that shows the interventions if you like. So another one that was developed almost simultaneously was Ending Self-Stigma by Amy Drapolsky and Alicia Luckstead at University of Maryland. A little bit later, Pat Corrigan developed what was originally called Coming Out Proud and is now called Honest, Open, and Proud. And then Zlaka Rusanova and others at Boston University developed this anti-stigma photo voice intervention. So these are all kind of things that started to come out at around the same time in the late, first decade of this millennium, and now all have research support to some extent. So yeah, so those are sort of the four that I would note. There were some others that were developed earlier that didn't really kind of get studied, and maybe just some other ones that have come out since, but these are the four that I would point most attention to.
And I could see from this list, and of course from your work with narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy, that there are elements to addressing self-stigma. So let's talk a little bit about some of those elements and the elements that you have in narrative enhancement cognitive therapy. And again, for folks in our audience, this is a bit of a preview. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Yanos is going to be doing 2 trainings coming up, and we'll give you information about that. But 2 trainings to provide you all with the information and skills and competencies that you need to run narrative enhancement cognitive therapy groups. But Phil, yeah, talk a little bit about narrative.
I mean, maybe if we can actually go back to the previous slide, I could just say, some of the common elements, in these interventions are, psychoeducation, is a common element in many. And then there's also this storytelling aspect as well. But in anti-stigma photo voice, it's narratives around photos that are taken specifically, right? So it's drawn from this photo voice technique that's originally starts in kind of as a research data collection approach, but is used as an intervention in this case. And this might be some similar to what some people might do in their daily life, where they take a picture and they post it on Instagram and they tell a story about it. And in Honest, Open, and Proud, it's very much about your disclosure story. Like, how do you tell someone about your mental illness and kind of open up to them about it? So we take a broader view where we're just looking at giving people a chance to tell stories about themselves. So now you can move to the next slide. And so what we're doing is letting them tell stories about themselves and integrate themes that are related to their consciousness around negative stereotypes about mental illness and their awareness of how they can negative biases and how they look at themselves can kind of infiltrate these accounts about themselves, right? So it's a group-based intervention, and it proceeds over a number of sessions. So the original version is a long version. It's a 20-session group-based manualized group-based intervention. We have a shorter group version now for young adults. But it starts with psychoeducation, where people are learning about stigma and they're learning about myths and replacing them with facts. And then it goes into teaching people cognitive restructuring skills, and specifically how to use it to address negative thoughts they have about themselves that are related by stigma and related by these negative stereotypes. And then it moves into the storytelling exercises. So we're bringing in a lot of the elements that you see in those other interventions, but we're doing them in a planful way that's kind of progressing toward what we think of as sort of the deepest form of the way a stigma affects the way people look at themselves, which is in the stories people tell about themselves.
And a couple of questions about NECT and the work. So you also mentioned, so initially your work started working with adults, well, adults with severe mental illness and looking at recovery. You talked a little bit about some adaptations that have been made. I think your colleagues are working on that for younger adults and family members. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Right. So right now we have a grant to adapt NECT for youth, which is defined as people between 15 and 24 who have experienced a first episode of psychosis recently, right? So this is a study that we're in the midst of. We've already adapted the manual after input from youth and family members. So members of the target population. And so what we've decided to do is we've adapted the manual. We've changed a lot of the examples in there. We've introduced some elements that people were saying kind of would speak to them more, like some video clips and things like that. And we've shortened it a bit, but we've also brought in this family member version, which is a brief 4-session psychoeducation parallel kind of intervention, where family members of the youth will learn about stigma and learn about self-stigma, so they can be real supports to their child or sibling, or whatever the relationship is, as they're kind of going on this journey of addressing self-stigma in the intervention. So that's something that we got very resounding support from both the family members and the youth about when we were asking people about what they thought about that. Interestingly, we did consider doing the intervention in individual version. A lot of people say, like, well, why are you still doing group? There are a lot of reasons why group makes sense for this type of intervention to begin with, especially if you're telling stories, that you have an audience for your stories. But a lot of folks know that it's not that easy to get people in groups So we were certainly open to the idea of doing it in individual version, but we heard pretty much almost unanimously from people that they thought that it should be in group form when we were asking them about it. Now, doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to get people to come and to find the times that work. And, is it going to be online or is it going to be in person? Those are things that we're still waiting to see what the participants that we're recruiting will be able to do. But people were clear that they thought it should be in a group format.
And you know what? One thought that I have too, though, Phil, is okay. So the intervention was developed. It sounds in large part with folks again with severe mental illness. And you mentioned that even the work with youth is
Right.
For those who've experienced first episode psychosis.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts though about the applicability to everyone sort of along the severity spectrum and its impact on them? What is your sense in terms of an intervention like this and the impact on those who, across, again, the severity spectrum?
Yeah, a lot of people say that they think that it would be helpful. It's definitely not the way that we were thinking about it. We were
Yeah.
definitely thinking about people who'd been hospitalized, who'd had those kinds of experiences, those kind of uh, experiences that let you feel like that you're part of this group that we could call serious mental illness or severe mental illness. But there's a study that's applying it to youth more broadly, adolescents who have a variety of diagnoses, including anxiety and autism spectrum, disorders. And it's going on right now in Australia. So that is an effort to apply it more broadly. I believe that all the youth in that treatment program have had a hospitalization experience, just they don't necessarily have something that has a psychosis component. So I definitely think that it speaks to people who've had these kinds of experiences of being hospitalized and the like. But I don't think that it should be restricted to people with schizophrenia specifically. There's another study that's going on in Canada where it's being adapted for youth with bipolar disorder specifically as well. I've always thought that it would be, appropriate for people with bipolar disorder. And that study, it was also adapted in conversation and collaboration with members of the lived experience community who would be the target group there. So I say it has a broader applicability, but I'm not ready to sort of say that it can be applied for everybody.
And thanks for that clarification. And so to go back and I agree with you, Phil. It just seems like an intervention like this can be so much more powerful in a group setting. But with that, as you mentioned, you kind of adapted it. It sounds like for individual use. But just your thoughts aside from NECT, and we hope that folks can join us in NECT, and we hope that folks can implement this as designed as a group model as much and as often as possible. But my question to you at this point is what can folks in this audience, what can folks do tomorrow? Individual providers, clinicians, or anyone, I should say, in any role that they have, peer service providers. What can folks do tomorrow in their work to try to address issues broadly of mental health stigma, but also self-stigma in particular?
Yeah, so I definitely think that you can do a lot that doesn't necessarily involve doing an intervention, although I have that on the list, right? But so, the first thing that I'd say is just talk to your clients about what stigma is and how it may have affected them, and validate their experiences and concerns about disclosure. So disclosure is quite scary. And we don't want to convey the message that it's an easy thing to do. We also don't want to convey the message that they should never do it, right? So this is a personal decision that people make after weighing the pros and cons and considering, if they can trust a certain person as well. Something that I've seen some people do is kind of, when they hear about stigma concern, they'll say that it's paranoia or it's depression or something like that. And I think that that's invalidating. This is a real thing that people are concerned about. You know, what'll happen if I go to, let's say, a house of worship, and I start talking to somebody, and then they know that I don't have a job, and they know that you know, I'm not married or something like that, and they start wondering, well, why? You know, these are the kinds of things that people are concerned about, and they're very, very real concerns. So we want to help people, support them to figure out how they could go into these situations and manage these very real concerns that they have that are related to stigma. The other thing that I think we can do right away is we can just give them information, give clients information about peer support. And so, you know, my knowledge is much more New York City oriented. So, you know, I have NAMI NYC Metro here, which has really developed an impressive array of support groups, and things in Spanish, and things focused on people who identify as AAPI, and people who identify as LGBTQ, and people identify as Black. So they have a number of excellent support groups available online and in person. So I would say just give people information. They may have no idea that these things exist. Let them know about DBSA, Depression Bipolar Support Alliance, the Hearing Voices Network, and then organizations like Baltic Street AEH here in New York City, People Incorporated, which is in the Hudson Valley area, and then there's a number of other organizations throughout the state. So I encourage you to give that information to people, and this could be itself a vehicle for people to overcome self-stigma. And then I also encourage you to think about how you could start an intervention group at your service setting. You could attend one of these trainings. Anybody who wants the manual, I give them the manual. We're going to develop a website where we're going to have everything posted in the next couple months. We're going to have all the different languages up, Spanish, Mandarin, Hebrew, Dutch, Danish. We have many, many languages that the manual's been translated into, and we'll have all of that available to the public. But in the meanwhile, just reach out to me, and I'll give you whatever you need to get started. And then I also encourage people to try to address stigma in society. And I know this is scary and it's overwhelming and draining, to speak up when your friends and relatives express ignorance, and to try to speak up, when you see it in the media by writing a letter. Again, I've gotten tired of that. I write the letters, they don't get published, but let's all try to do our part to pitch in to change the dialogue in society as much as we can. And then work on our own burnout, because that can be one of the things that leads us to have less empathy for people when they're talking about these things. And it might lead us to kind of reinforce some of these messages that people hear from others in the community. So work on that through supervision, through getting support from our peers, and also try to help others too as well.
And I think for our audience, we're going to switch in a minute to Q&A. But for our audience, I know a big part that I learned from you, Phil, as we were doing again the roundtables, is the notion of associative stigma, and this last piece that you talked about, burnout, for our audience. Could you just say a little bit more about that? I think we also kind of referred to it as professional mental health stigma as well. So if you could just say a few words about that.
Right. So the idea here is that we are stigmatized as well, right? As people who work with a stigmatized group. We as professionals, again, any non-professional in the audience, sorry if I'm excluding you. So as a result, we react to that, devaluing of our work, devaluing of the people that we work with by others, by shutting down, not wanting to talk about it. And we also maybe that erodes our sense of purpose in our work, and we start to feel like it's not that as valuable as it was to us when we first got into it. So that's where this burnout thing comes in. And we might direct some of our kind of anger at being devalued ourselves toward the people that we're working with, and that can inadvertently increase their self-stigma in an indirect process. And we don't have research data on that part of it, but we do have research support for associative stigma, being associated with burnout, So that's something that I think we can try to study further in the future, but it'd be a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I going back to, the opening remarks around how, in some ways, mental health stigma, and I believe the research bears this out, that attitudes about mental health and mental illness are somewhat improving in the positive direction, but again, there still remains sort of these stigmatizing attitudes in the public around people with severe mental illness. And I say that too, because I can feel it, especially I think as a result of doing this work with you, where I see it more, especially again in the media representations, and it becomes increasingly frustrated as you see those messages. And so how those kind of messages that you see and how folks are being portrayed in the media can really impact your own thinking process, your own beliefs.
Yeah, and I'm gonna unfortunately put a little bit of a downer on that, and that attitudes toward mental health, broadly speaking, are improving. We have kind of a normalization of the dialogue, but there's still kind of this line, between common mental health experiences, depression and anxiety, trauma related experiences, let's say, and serious mental health conditions that have a psychosis component. And when you look at data from the General Social Survey, the most recent data is from 2018. Evidence supports that it's attitudes toward people with schizophrenia have gotten worse in the U.S. Since the last time the data was collected in I think 2006. So it's a mixed bag in that regard. And I would say that I think that if you're a person with psychosis type experiences, and you see attitudes improving towards people with depression and anxiety, that can increase maybe some of your, but not towards psychosis. It can increase your sense of alienation in a sense, being left out of this.
Yeah.
So I think that we shouldn't rest on our laurels, and we should do what we can to help everybody with a mental health condition to feel accepted and feel like they can speak openly.
Thanks for clarifying that, Phil. And actually, so we're gonna go to Q&A. We can go to Q&A, and for folks, I see questions have been, as we sort of prompted folks to do, questions have been coming in. So we have a few. Please take a moment, folks, who haven't had a chance to sort of text in or their questions or chat in their questions. Take a moment to do that. However, we do have a couple. And speaking of this issue of groups of folks with mental illness, and so one of the questions that came to from Catherine is, could NECT be used with substance use disorder treatment? So that's another group, right? That's another, right? So when we think about
certainly it's been used with people with co-occurring substance use issues, right? But it has not been developed specifically for substance use related stigma. So that's a great question. I would say most people with substance use conditions have co-occurring mental health conditions, right? But specifically addressing the substance use related stigma, that's not something that we've gotten into, and I think that's an area that could be explored in the future.
Yeah, and my understanding, Phil, and if you could bring some clarity to this, that in some instances, I think, as you were mentioning, right, the view of other mental health disorders versus more severe forms of mental illness, there's that differentiation, but also there's that differentiation between folks with mental illness and substance use disorders, and there's still high degrees of stigma against folks with substance use disorders.
Yeah, and it's not an area that I've studied, but it is fascinating to me because there's on the one hand we have a glamorization of substance use in society, right? It's associated with certain aspects of being free and fun and things like that, and that draws young people to it, right? But then once people shift into the area of being seen as an addict or somebody who's can't control it, right? Then they're demonized and it flips very quickly, right? So I'm very fascinated by that. As somebody who's kind of personally anti-drug, I don't really kind of have an inherent understanding of it because my personal approach has always been to not use drugs. But I know people who have. I've lost people in my life to overdoses and things like that. So I know that this is something that affects tons of people.
Well, and similarly, yet another question of looking at physical health issues. So Carrie asks, could this illness identity model also apply to those with medical or health issues? This especially comes to mind to those who have comorbid mental health and physical health issues. I know some work has been done on stigma with regards to other health-related conditions, things like cancer, diabetes, certainly HIV is a huge one. So your thoughts about that?
Right. So HIV would be the one that has the most research, and we have been interested in applying it to people with HIV and mental health conditions, which is a very large number of people with HIV. So that's something that I'm interested in. And I do believe that it could be applied. But I think you have to adapt it so that it's responsive to the negative stereotypes. I think the parts that would be useful regardless is learning cognitive restructuring and the storytelling aspects. So those could remain largely the same. But the psychoeducation part would have to be adapted to address the unique negative stereotypes that are applied to that health condition, whether it's that people are to blame for it, or that people can't get better and things like that. So there's some overlap and some things that are going to be distinct.
Thank you, Bill. Let's go. So many of the questions are in the realm of adaptations.
Yeah.
Just thought. So Karen, yet another sort of adaptation. I think thoughts about adapting NECT specifically for, and it looks like a number of group, older adults, the BIPOC community, populations experiencing compounded stigma from multiple elements of identity. Great question, Karen. Thank you. These are all great questions. But yes, this issue, and we talked about this in the roundtables, right? Folks who are multiply stigmatized because of mental illness and being a member of marginalized groups. Your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah. So when we were developing NECT, Paul Lysacker, Gabriel, and I were all did groups in our locations, and Paul was doing it in the VA in Indianapolis, Indiana, which Indianapolis is a predominantly African American community, at least in the areas where Paul was working. I was doing groups at Pathways to Housing in New York City with formerly homeless people who were predominantly African American as well. And David was doing in Israel with, Jewish people and maybe some Arab Israelis, but not the type of diversity that we see in these urban areas in the United States. So I would say is from the beginning, we were definitely thinking about intersectional stigma as experienced by the communities that we work with, right? So I was working in Newark, New Jersey. I was very steeped in how the Black experience affected people with mental illness, and how these overlapping forms of oppression affected people. So it definitely was something that we were informed by. But I will say that we could do more with it. And there's a paper that was recently published that I'm a co-author on. Oh, it's in press now, which was focused on stigma experiences among youth from marginalized communities. All the youth involved in that project are of color, let's say. So, it's definitely something that I think we can do more with, but it's something we've been attuned to from the beginning because of the places that we were working. In terms of LGBTQ individuals. There was an adaptation that was done in Israel, and there's a paper that's in press about that. And I've also been interested in that, and it's something that I think could be explored further.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are areas that I think could use more development, but there are some papers that are out there that do touch
Yeah.
it.
And I did notice, I think I
Mm,
apologize if I can't remember the exact citation, but I think it might have been one of your colleagues talking about, especially in the adaptation for youth,
mhm.
a big piece of it was identity. Obviously, these issues around intersectional, the sort of the intersections of mental illness and other marginalized identities is a big piece of it for anyone. But
Right.
a lot of the discussion around the adaptation for youth focused a lot on identity for obvious reasons. Youth, that's the, as kind of we know, just back to Ericksonian sort of, that's the major sort of issue for young people.
Right. That's a paper
Identity.
that Joe DeLuca and I wrote. That's in the Journal of Health Service Psychology in the current issue of it. Yeah, and so it focuses on the intersectional, um, you know, ways of addressing stigma using these interventions. And so I think that would be a great article to look at, to think about how to incorporate intersectionality into doing an intervention like this. So that article, it's more of a clinically focused article rather than a research article that gives people an overview of both intersectionality and self-stigma and how these things can be worked with together.
And actually, possibly relatedly, another question that comes up in this same realm, but talking about for young adults. So Deborah asked, are you looking at different outcomes for the adult NECT and young adult or youth NECT versions?
Well, we're always interested in the how it affects people's views of themselves, so self-esteem and hopefulness, and we're also interested in work and school and social relationships. But what we're particularly interested in for the youth, it's actually our main outcome variable for our funded study, is service engagement, right? Both the quality of the relationship with professionals and then actual sort of quantitative engagement. And that's because there's a real issue, even with a very successful model, which is the coordinated specialty care model for first episode psychosis. Even in that successful model, there's evidence that a lot of people drop out, or don't engage, 30–40%, something like that. So we're trying to use this to try to increase engagement in services, which is also going to be a vehicle toward helping people to get back to school, get jobs, re-engage with friends and the like.
And I'm curious a little bit about that. Is the idea that for youth and young adults, mental health stigma may play a greater role in service engagement?
Yeah, I guess so, because it's a new thing, right? You're still figuring out who you are, right? Think about 15 to 24, right? Go back to when you were 15 to 24. Did you know who you were? I definitely didn't, right? So you're figuring that out, and then someone tells you that you have this label, right? This thing that is big, that's a big deal, right? And now you're trying to figure that out. You're like, well, so is this me? Is this going to define me, or is this some part of me, or is this something that I'm going to say is my superpower, or is this something I'm just going to say like doesn't matter that much, or am I going to pretend it doesn't exist? So there's a lot of things that are going on at that time as people are trying to make sense of who they are, and that's why we think it could be a big factor in somebody saying like, well, I'm going to stay as far away from this mental health system as possible, and then that could lead to some of those really traumatic experiences, involuntary hospitalizations, being brought in, by force, by police and things like that. So perhaps we can prevent a lot of untoward things in the future if people get engaged in a very recovery-oriented service approach, right, early on, and that can really prevent many of the things that we think lead self-stigma to be so ingrained later on. Yeah.
Fantastic. I know we have 3 minutes left, but I want to try to squeeze at least one of these last two questions. Lauren asked, and this is a wonderful question, I think maybe to end on as well. Could this approach be utilized to help individuals with gaining acceptance of their mental illness for those with poor insight? Great question.
Yeah.
Lauren.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of another talk for another time, but you know, insight is not, we don't focus on it. You don't have to have it, right? We allow people to define themselves the way they want. It's clear we're saying that the mental illness that you've been diagnosed with, right? So not that it's a fact, but that the fact is that you have the diagnosis, right? And we allow people to say what they think it is. But we have found that there seems to be some improvement in awareness and coming to terms with it over time, you know, in this type of intervention. And some of that seems to come through that process of telling stories and also hearing other people tell their stories and being able to accept that one might be going through something similar. Yeah. So it definitely is something that it wasn't what we were trying to address, but it seems like something that can be a secondary outcome of it.
Yeah, and I would just think through that normalizing and validating process alone, it could lead to that space where folks are not so defensive about it, right? So hopefully this is quick, but do you have any books or articles that you would recommend that talks about microaggressions and related to mental health stigma? Because I know you kind of touched on those, but you kind of made that connection. But anything in the literature, any folks doing work on really understanding that?
Some other people have done stuff on it. Petra Granholm from in the UK has done some, but I think most of it will be in my book if you're interested in reading about it. I have stuff online. I've written a blog about it that you could look up. If you look up Yanos microaggressions psychology today, you'll find it. So yeah, not that much, but you know, we did get that area started, and some others have picked up on it.
Thank you, Phil. So we unfortunately, folks, we have to end. Though all of those questions were wonderful. Thank you all for those of you who submitted questions that really helped to deepen our discussion. Really quick review of what's coming up. As we mentioned, we have something on school coming up on school refusal and difficulties with that when children and adolescents do not go to school. Understanding mass shootings, supporting youth and families in the community through our collective trauma. As we already mentioned, Phil's training on narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy. There's going to be 2 versions of it. He's going to do one training on the adult version. That's going to be on October 19th from 10 to 12. That's going to be a full training, 2 hours. And then the second one is going to be on October 26th. That one is going to focus on the adaptations for youth and caregivers. Please go to our CTAC website and register for those. And then there's also Advancing Southeast Asian American Mental Health, Critical Refugee Studies Lens in Care on October 24th. Again, I want to thank you, Phil, for an amazing talk today. And I think I look forward to your 2 trainings coming up. We look forward to having you all who've been in this conversation today join us in that in those 2 trainings. And again, one last thank you to Phil for a wonderful and amazing talk today.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.